Hello, I'm Dr Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. If you've daydreamed about a few days in hospital to get a break, you might be burnt out. When I read this on our guest's website, I thought two things. One, I'd never heard anyone voice that daydream before. And two, I'd never considered myself someone who's experienced burnout before. And perhaps I have. And I will not be asking today's guest to diagnose me at all, but I'm going to share you a quick story. So I was undertaking my honours degree and I was determined to get the marks I needed to get a full scholarship to do a PhD. I had interrupted my professional career. I had been working full-time for a number of years before I left teaching to work for Beyond Blue. I left Beyond Blue to start my honours so that I could earn my way into a PhD, and I actually even started my honours early in the hope that I could get a head start. But in fact, my supervisor used that as an opportunity just to stretch me even more and to give me an additional element to my research for that year. That made for a very big year ahead of me. Towards the end, when I was about to go into university to deliver my thesis defense and to answer a lot of questions from the professors and the lecturers and fellow students, particularly the ones who had started their PhDs, who were notorious for asking the tough questions. And my cat was declining in health at the same time. So I had this perfect storm of a very high stakes presentation, a huge amount of prolonged stress, the added layer of my cat, who was in her late teens, declining in health so much that we were very close to making a decision about having her put down. And all of that was creating this very, very stressful experience for me. And I remember walking the dog one day, walking just to take a break from it all. And I remember a car coming towards me and me thinking, if I just had a little run over my toe, maybe I might get a break. Maybe I might get to take a few days away from all of this that is just becoming too much to handle, and end up in hospital for a few days. And it wasn't about getting hurt. It wasn't not about that. It was about the desperate need for a chance to put all of the balls I was juggling down. And when I read Debbie Sorensen's website and read about this daydream about a few days in hospital, being very clear again, it was just about the rest, it dawned on me that perhaps at that time, in that perfect storm, burnout was something that I was experiencing. And I've since spoken to people who have expressed similar kind of far-fetched ideas and thoughts that they'd had about things going wrong in a way that would really cause everything just to stop for a little while, just to have a break, have a rest, and be able to reset. And so I think just interviewing Debbie today has given me quite that revelation, and preparing for that interview, I should say. And we think about burnout typically being associated with the workplace, but it's not always the case. It's often the case, but I was a student, and parents can experience it too. So carers, parents, students, outside of the workplace, we're not immune. And I think today's conversation is really going to help us to think about it and understand it in a way that we can perhaps relate what we learn to other people in our lives that we care about. Today's guest, our burnout guide, is Debbie Sorensen, PhD. She is a clinical psychologist who specialises in acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, for adults experiencing burnout, chronic stress and anxiety. She has a PhD from Harvard. She's an author, co-host of the Psychologist Off the Clock podcast, a wife, a mum, and a dog lover just like me. Debbie, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jodi. It's so nice to be here. I'm really grateful that you have me on. Thank you.
It's a big issue and has been labelled an epidemic. And I know that it's not a simple experience and it's not a simple solution. So I'm really thankful to you to helping us understand more about it. You write the cycles of burnout? Can you start by explaining those to us today?
I have a bit of a cold, so please pardon my voice. I think it's really important with burnout to recognize that it is complex. It's not necessarily a one size fits all type of experience, but there are some patterns that we see. And I think the cycle of burnout always starts with chronic stress. It's in a context of chronic stress. And as you mentioned earlier, I think we traditionally think of it as workplace stress. And in fact, that's what the World Health Organization definition focuses on. But any chronically stressful area of life, we can experience burnout. So it could be something more personal that is a chronically stressful role there that we're in. But the cycle always starts with that. And then what happens is that, of course, when we're chronically stressed, we're going to feel that, we're going to experience that stress. We're going to feel that in our emotions and in our body. That's normal. And I think stress is part of life. The goal in life, sometimes chronic stress is very systemic, and we want to take a look at whether there's something that we need to change. But it's very normal to have a reaction to that. But I think what often happens, and this is what I see a lot in my burnout work, is that is kind of at its core what happens, right? Is that we're stressed and we feel it. But often we get kind of dug in deeper with chronic stress, where we do things not necessarily on purpose or consciously. We do things that kind of keep that cycle going. Sometimes, and this is where my acceptance and commitment therapy background really comes out. Sometimes we do things because we don't like the way that we feel when we're stressed that actually exacerbate the problem and kind of keep us locked into that. So I don't know if it might be helpful for me to give a few examples of that. Okay, so for instance, and these are just probably going to sound familiar because we all probably do some of these at some point. So one thing we might do is try to outwork stress, right? So I have a to-do list a mile long, and I just think, okay, I'm going to work super hard and be as busy and hardworking as I can. And at some point, I'm going to get through that to-do list and I'm going to feel better. But being in that very hardworking, like sort of overworking, overly busy cycle, that keeps us locked in because that to-do list never seems to get quite mastered. Sometimes we might do something like have a stressful day at work and go home and have a couple of drinks to take the edge off of the stress. And that works for a few hours. But then the next day we might be more tired and more prone to stress and anxiety. You might just not sleep as well, or maybe you were even planning to get a couple things done that night that would actually legitimately help you. But then the night sort of goes by in a blur.
Yes.
Yeah. So something like that, we might even get into cycles of perfectionism, cycles of procrastination. And again, we all probably do these things sometimes, but I do think that sometimes when we get into that pattern of trying to control or avoid stress in unhelpful ways, it just locks us in and keeps the cycle going, right? So in the long term, these things tend not to work super well.
It makes perfect sense. And I'm sure there's a lot of nodding going on. And yes, it's so interesting and it makes sense. We have a stress response and we have it for a good reason, but it's not meant to be chronically activated, is it?
No. And I think that's kind of the world we live in, unfortunately, is that many of us are just in situations where maybe our job's really demanding or we're under a lot of pressure or we don't have the support and resources we need. And so it's really kind of cultural and systemic. But I think for many of us, that feeling of that you mentioned earlier, well, maybe I could go to the hospital for a few days, not with anything serious, but just to have a break. I think that's an escape fantasy because sometimes it feels like there's no escape from the chronic stress of just living in the world we're in today.
See, and it's sad when you think about that, isn't it? Because life is amazing and it's difficult and it's challenging and it's full of opportunities and it's just full of possibility, but it's very hard, I think, when we do get kind of laser focused, especially when work is very demanding and we live in very uncertain times still. Those of us that are parents and carers and looking after people, there is no stepping out of that role for any length of time. But for people who are in the workplace, there's equally that fear of perhaps losing a job. And so that doubling down, it makes so much sense. And yet, on the face of it, this idea that I think about taking regular breaks and investing in ourselves and resting and doing things that are fun, doing things that we enjoy, engaging with people and getting into flow and having opportunities to take mindful moments. And all of these things can be sort of woven into our lives. But so often it's just about, I've just got to get this done. So often for people, I worry that there just doesn't feel like that almost that luxury to do something for themselves, even though in the long run, it's going to help them with every aspect of their life, including their work.
Yeah, I fall into this trap myself all the time. And you may imagine that I wrote this book in part because I had an experience of burnout years ago. And of course, have had some burnout since then, kind of comes and goes, I think. But my most severe period of burnout was a number of years ago. But one of the things that I tend to do is to get into that mindset of, well, as soon as I'm caught up on things, then I'm going to start taking weekends off and I'm going to start taking better care of myself and getting a good night of sleep and that kind of thing. And I think I always felt like I was right around the corner from that. Oh, in a couple of weeks, this is going to be done. And then I'll feel better and I'll be through my to-do list and then I'll be able to take a break. And I think what I had to come to terms with is that I can't wait for that. If I do, I'll be waiting forever because that list is going to keep going and more things are going to come onto it. And so, yeah, I think sometimes it's exactly what we need the most is very hard to access when we're under a tremendous amount of stress.
Debbie, you've written a book to really help people understand and address burnout, and you've written it through the lens of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT as we know and love it. And it's a modality that I am incredibly passionate about also. Can you talk to us about when it comes to supporting clients, and you work in private practice in Denver, Colorado, so you are seeing people who are experiencing burnout all the time. How is it that you came to find acceptance and commitment therapy makes such a powerful difference when you're working with clients, no matter where they are on that kind of burnout road?
Well, I think acceptance and commitment therapy is a good fit for burnout. There's some research studies to support this, some studies where they looked at is acceptance and commitment therapy helpful for burnout? And all signs point to, it seems to be, there aren't a ton of studies, but there are some. I think the reason it fits for me theoretically, there's a couple things. One is that acceptance and commitment therapy is very contextual. The approach is that all human behavior makes sense in context. And we know from burnout, it happens in context. So it happens in the context of chronic stress. We live in this very stressful world. People are experiencing chronic stress. So it's less pathologizing because to some degree, it makes sense that you're feeling this thing we call burnout when this is the way that things are for you. And so I really appreciate that about ACT. It's like you're having a normal human reaction to a hard situation. Makes sense that you feel this way. And then I think that, again, that cycle of burnout we were talking about, I think the idea philosophically behind ACT is that our emotions are okay. We need to make room for them. So instead of struggling against our emotions, let's make room for how we feel. Sometimes there's some wisdom in our emotions, but we can move more toward a place of emotional acceptance, of awareness. So being aware of thoughts that might be keeping us stuck in burnout. We can do some perspective taking. We can do some mindfulness to just help us be more aware and centered. And then there's also the other side of the ACT model, which is at least as important, which is the change side of things, right? So often with burnout, people have really gotten disconnected. That's kind of part of burnout. People are exhausted. They feel like they don't care anymore. And ACT is all about helping people reconnect with their values and reconnect with what's important to them. And sometimes we have to make some changes and they can be hard ones. So for instance, in the case of burnout, sometimes people have to get better at saying no and setting boundaries. They have to maybe change their job if it's so chronically stressful and there's no way out of that, or if it's not a good fit or something like that. Sometimes a pretty drastic change is needed, but sometimes it's even a smaller change. Like you were saying earlier, I need to start getting sleep, taking better care of myself, putting my work down at 5 p.m. so that I'm not just working constantly or something like that. Sometimes we need to work more towards systemic change, like the way that my workplace is not working for me, or I'm having parental burnout. I need help. I need some support. I need someone to help me with the domestic and childcare tasks or caregiving tasks. So I think what I like about it is that it's complex and it really depends person to person. You know, do you need to work more on the internal piece of it, or do you need to make an external change? Well, that's really going to depend person to person, maybe both. But I like that the model sort of, it makes room for all of those things.
It does. And I think the idea that it is in context, that it makes sense that I felt the way that I felt under the circumstances that I was under. I had enormous pressure on myself. I had, driven by my values, I was so determined to get into a PhD with a full scholarship so that I could continue, because if I didn't, then I would have either had to undertake a PhD part-time or not at all. They're really big life choices. And so I was driven. We hurt where we care and we care where we hurt. Steve Hayes says that so eloquently. And yes, it's hard, isn't it? When, I mean, in hindsight, and I know you were reflecting before on your experience, when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the middle of it, it can be hard to see what's happening. And so I'd really love to ask you to share with our listeners today, what are some of the things that they can look out for? And I know it's complex. There's no hacks, there's no quick fixes, but I'd like to sort of help people understand, what can they look out for so they don't get to 49 like me and go, oh, those years ago I went through that and that was really difficult and it's quite a blur. They can see it when it's happening and be in a better position to do something. And then perhaps after that, we might be able to talk about some of the changes that people might be able to start to get on that road to recovery.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question because much like you described earlier, when I was burnt out, it took me a long time to understand what was going on, which is surprising because I know a lot about burnout. I was working in healthcare at the time. I was a psychologist on a medical team. I knew intellectually about it, but I still missed the signs in myself. And I had this aha moment when I realized this is not me. This is burnout. And I think in hindsight, I think, how did I miss it? But yeah, so there are a few things you can look out for. I mean, one is really pretty obvious, which is just that chronic stress. I mean, if you're just feeling like the stress never lets up, it's day after day. Maybe you're in a situation like healthcare where the stressors are numerous, but I mean, there's a million other areas where you might experience this high level of stress. One of the key indicators of burnout is exhaustion. So if you notice, I'm just so tired, I feel drained, fatigued, and it's not sleepy when you didn't get a good night of sleep. It's not like that. It's more like just this fatigue, like you've got nothing left to give feeling.
Yeah.
A feeling like that. Often people feel either disconnected, like I normally care deeply about my job. And that's often people who are prone to burnout do care deeply about their role that they're in, but you just have lost touch with that feeling. And that was something that I experienced. I just felt like I was just disconnected. I was like, I don't even care anymore. And that is very much not like me typically. Sometimes people are cynical. They're just very focused on the negative. They're just feeling like, what's the point of all this? And it's specific to that stressful domain. But then you also want to look for those behavior patterns we were talking about earlier. Like, am I shortchanging sleep? Am I drinking too much? Am I procrastinating all the time? Am I getting really caught up in that perfectionism or overwork cycle? I think a lot of times people prone to burnout can have a little bit of a workaholic streak. So those kinds of indicators, I think, might be a sign. And then you could just ask yourself, because that could be a number of things, right? I actually think there's a way of assessing your own burnout, which is we all have an intuitive sense of it. It's like, how burned out do you think you are on a scale of 0 to 10 right now? And if it's high, well, then you're probably experiencing burnout. And it's funny because that's actually a validated measure. There are more formal measures of burnout that are like multi-questions. But if you basically ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how burned out are you? They kind of typically have a little bit of an intuitive sense of it. So if all else fails, just ask yourself that. And if it's above, say 5, you might want to just say, hey, okay, what's going on here?
I love that you're able to simplify. And like you say, it's a validated measure that typically if people rate themselves highly, they are struggling with burnout. I spend a lot of time working in schools and working with teachers. And gosh, it's tough. It's tough for so many people in so many professions. And I think one of the things that must be very, very hard when you are feeling burnt out, you are really struggling, is this idea that there's only so much that's in your own control. That day to day to day, especially using teaching as an example, you are fronting up. It's unpredictable. There are a lot of spot fires to put out. There's a lot of administration. There's a lot of interactions. There's a lot of disputes, and so much required of you from your energy and your heart and your head. How do you help people reconcile this idea that you can feel burnt out and feel like I need a break in a context that is very much an environment that makes sense of the burnout, but there's very little that people can do other than leaving that role to make that change? How do you help people to reconcile that and do what they can within their own limitations in the circumstances that they're in?
I mean, I love this question. I think it's a really big one because people often look at the world of burnout and say, if things need to change, for instance, I'm glad you raised teaching as an example because that's another big area, especially lately here in the US. I don't know about Australia, but teachers are very
huge.
stressed. There's a teacher shortage. It's really hard. The world has been a little wacky the last few years. So you might say, well, that's what needs to change for teachers to not get burned out. We have to change it at that big level. And I think that's absolutely true. But that doesn't really help the third grade teacher who's currently just so exhausted because they can't wait for the system to change. I mean, I hope we're all working toward that. I think that this is where that piece around acceptance is really important. And I'm not talking about acceptance of the situation. I think you should change the situation as best you can and do things that are going to improve it as much as you have the power to. But I'm talking about acceptance of your own emotions. You know, getting up to teach each and every morning is difficult and stressful, and it's okay to feel that way. Of course you feel that way. You're in a really hard situation. Maybe you can be compassionate toward yourself and kind toward yourself. If you're noticing that that is starting to affect how you're feeling and how you're doing, I think that that's a really big piece of it is being, I guess, compassionate toward yourself for struggling with that. If you're a teacher, it's not your fault that you're stressed and burned out right now. It's the world we live in. And so, yeah, of course we want to change what we can, but I also think that sometimes, for instance, connecting with your values within that can be really important. If you're in a line of work like teaching, it's probably because you care about it. And can you tap into that even on the hard days? Can you speak up about some of the things that would be helpful to you to make the situation better? Sometimes you can. Sometimes, though, that doesn't do much. And I think we all have to admit the truth of that. Like, I hope in the long term that this situation will improve and we can all work toward that. But in the meantime, you know, you kind of do what you can.
I love the idea that you raised self-compassion and I think just this acknowledgement that, yes, under these circumstances, it is hard. And I am finding it tough, but I'm not alone. And that refocusing on values and that compassion for self that, yes, I am going through a really difficult time at the moment. I know when I do talk to teachers, one of the things that I do talk to them about are there boundaries? Because it seems that a lot of teachers, in an effort to stay on top, double down on answering their emails and communicating with their families, depending on whether they're primary or secondary, and corresponding with colleagues late into the night. And that one email, you just have to get that one email, that one message that makes you a little bit wobbly, that is a bit stressful or worrying or feels unfair, that is going to then have that impact on your sleep that night, which is so important. It's just such a cornerstone of our mental health and our well-being, isn't it? And so I talk to teachers about, within the realms of what you can control, one thing that you can do is put in a boundary for when you are tools down and you take a break and you step away, because work is a part of our life. I remember when I was a teacher, Debbie, I was still living at home. I was fresh out of university and I'd started teaching. And when I taught physical education and chemistry. So I've always had this deep love of health and well-being and science. And I remember I got a phone call. This is back in the day where you had a phone that was connected to the wall at home. I answered the phone and they said, "Little Johnny left his blazer in the gym today. Do you know where it is?" And I would have a very different conversation with that parent if I was receiving that phone call now to receiving that phone call as a very fresh graduate, because what an invasion of privacy and what a sense of entitlement that particular parent had, that they could ring me, look me up in the phone book. And so it was happening then for me. Like, that was certainly work spilling into my home life. But these days it's emails. It's something that teachers can walk away from. So I'm not saying it's easy. We're not saying that, but just that there are some things within our control, aren't there, when we are experiencing chronic stress, and some that aren't. And it's really nice to be able to just have a think about where change can be made.
Yeah, I think that's so true. This kind of always on world that we live in, where you're expected to respond to a parent's email at 10 p.m. or on the weekend or whatever the field that you're in. I think it just feels like we can never truly turn off and take that time for ourselves. I don't think that's the only thing going on here, but I think that is a piece of it, is that that's become just the norm and the expectation in a way that really does contribute to the burnout, to the chronic stress and burnout.
Stress.
Yeah.
And it brings me to parenthood, because unlike in the workplace where you can close your laptop and walk away or not pick up your phone, parenting is, depending on the age of your children, of course. I think very young children, it's demanding in different ways, I should say. But gosh, it is difficult, isn't it, for parents who are feeling burned out? And I wonder if you could share some insights or some ideas for parents who might be listening and thinking, hey, this is me, but what on earth can I do?
Yes. Okay. So I'm glad you raised this parental burnout. There's a lot of research about it, actually. And I think it's been a little bit overlooked over the years as people focus on workplace burnout and occupational burnout. But it is such a chronically stressful role. It never stops. I guess the main word of wisdom I can offer is that, to me, I think it's another area where parents don't have the amount of support that they need quite typically. I mean, some do, but I think the parents that tend to get burnt out, they're very invested. They often are not getting a lot of social support or even practical support. So often people are at risk if, for instance, their kids are young and demanding, or maybe they have a child with a special need or something like that is going to add stress to the situation. And either maybe they don't have a partner, or they have a partner who isn't as engaged, or they don't have much in the way of child care help or something like that. And so just the demand is constantly placed on them. And then on top of that, often there is this pressure, I think, that parents feel to be constantly engaging with your kids. Make sure that you're enriching them, and don't do this and do that. And I think that that's a piece of it. I don't think every parent feels that pressure. Some parents are barely struggling to get by. But I think a lot of times parenting is an example of something where sometimes I think people get stressed out about not doing it right. And people have very
Yes.
high standards on themselves
Yes.
and are often experiencing that without the level of resources that would help them be able to do it and still have some time for themselves, have support, have a break. So
Yes.
it's tough out there for us
It's
parents. I'm a
tough out
parent
there.
too. And
Yes. It is. It is. It really is. It's a very complex topic we're talking about. But any other suggestions that you might have for listeners in terms of making change before we find out where they can access this brilliant new resource that you've created to really support people on this journey?
well, I think it's something that we've alluded to, but I haven't really said quite strongly enough. I think that the role of getting support is crucial. People that you know will be there for you, that you can talk to about this, people who will support you. So if you're a teacher, it could be your colleagues, it could be your friends, family, spouse, whoever it may be. I think that it's absolutely crucial if you're feeling chronically stressed and burned out that you not suffer alone, that you get support from someone who you can open up to and who will greet your suffering with kindness and compassion. And even just sometimes acknowledging it, saying the words out loud to someone, I'm exhausted, I'm depleted. I think we all need some people in our life who can support us in those moments when we're not at our best and when we are really in need of some emotional support.
Oh, Debbie, thank you. It's a really important message that you've shared about support and that we don't have to do it alone. We don't have to. And that actually what we know as humans is that people like to help. I want to add to that too, that sometimes we can ask, what can I do to help? Whereas it often works well if you just say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this for you. And if you can see a place where you might be able to lighten the load a little bit or provide support or be a listening ear, then because I think, is it fair to say that sometimes when a person is experiencing burnout, you say, just sing out if you need some help or what can I do to help? That person may very well just go, yeah, I'll let you know, but may not ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I have a piece in my book about asking for help and when
Oh.
to reach out and speak up about that. But people, yes. And sometimes we don't realize maybe that that's kind of what's needed. And just knowing that people are there, whether you take them up on it or not, makes a huge difference. It just makes you feel less alone.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Debbie, I'm so excited for you. You've got a new book launching in 2024. Can you tell us all about it, please?
Yeah, it's called Act for Burnout, Recharge, Reconnect, and Transform Burnout with Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Bit of a mouthful, but it's all kind of walking through in detail what we talked about today. It's for anyone who's experiencing burnout. I think that even, like I said, burnout is complex and it's not one size fits all, but I think anyone who's experienced burnout will find something in there that they can relate to. And so, yeah, it's coming out in January.
Oh, congratulations. It's very exciting and
Thank you.
it's exciting on so many levels. One, because it's a huge undertaking to write a book and it's like your shoulders drop and you can breathe and know that you've created something that is going to be so helpful, knowing how powerful acceptance and commitment therapy has been in my own life and in the lives of the people that I work with, and of course, people all over the world working with ACT. It's very exciting to know that this is coming. So thank you very much for taking the time to do the research and to pull together all of your experience, years and years of experience and research and wisdom to create a resource that can really support people. So keep an eye out, people, and it will be available in all of the wonderful places that you can buy books. And I always love people to support their independent bookstores. But of course, here in Australia, we may need to purchase it online. So Debbie, thank you for sharing your time with us today. I'm so grateful. It's just been a delight chatting with you. How can our listeners find you and connect with you online?
Well, I have a website, DrDebbieSorensen.com. I'm pretty easy to Google. You can also find me through Psychologist Off the Clock, which is my podcast. If you like hearing my voice, there's lots more where that came from.
Yes.
So either of those, and you can email me. My contact information is on both of those websites too. So you can find me there.
Oh, sensational. And I'll include all of those in the notes for the episode. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation and for sharing what you are so passionate about with our listeners today. I know that our listeners today will have taken away so many insights, ideas, and also I think that there will be some seeds planted for change. And that's what I love about this podcast, is that not only can people learn and understand, that they can start to do things differently. So we really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Jodi. It's really a pleasure. I love your podcast, and it's really nice to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much again for joining us. I am just so grateful always for you sharing your time and your ears with me. So thank you again. And I cannot wait to be back with you again next week. Okay, bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.